So I've been having the exact same nightmare over the past couple of weeks. It starts with Kumo dragging me out of bed and propping me in front of a computer that reads, "No more AMG and M passenger cars. From now on, baby buggies." Then I wake up in a cold sweat and I realize it was just a bad dream. Or was it? Because we already lived through this rodeo over the past 10, 20 years on the serial production side of the car world. And now, at the same time, we've been getting more and more and more and more of these. So the question is, will cars like the M3 go the way of the dodo bird? Now, before you label me a conspiracy theorist, here are some facts. That is the exact same engine that lives in every current generation M3 and M4, meaning it's the S58 3-liter inline turbocharged 6-cylinder engine that is on offer in two flavors. There is the bargain basement cheap seats that is 473 horsepower and 457 pound-feet of torque, or there's this, the competition, say it with me, 503 horsepower and 479 pound-feet of torque. Yes, it is on offer only as all-wheel drive, because look at the carrying case it's in. Then there's something interesting that it comes with that's fitted as standard, and that is the M Sport exhaust. Then there's the fuel economy. Do we really need to talk about fuel economy and something that's badged with a full fat M? If you really want to, here we go, 17, 25, 20 combined. Then there are the performance figures, 3.9 seconds to 60 in the cheap seats, 3.7 in the competition, and then there's the VMAX, 155 like the M3 and M4, but with the right stroll down the options lane, it could be 174 over at the cheap seats or 177 here. Admittedly, a bit taller than the cadre of M3s and M4s you and I have been driving as of late. And yes, that would translate to more weight. 4,610 pounds, or depending on how you express your weights and measures, 2,091 kilograms. For the avoidance of doubt, that's about 600 pounds heavier than an M3 all-wheel drive. With that, little bit of delay there, but oh yeah, tabs open up completely. God, this is very fast for a baby buggy. This, it delivers power, I want to say like an M3, because that's the same engine, but it's a bit different because it has more mass it's trying to pull, and you feel that extra mass. There's no way really to cloak that extra 600 pounds there. Let me put this to you in a bit of a different light. The best way to describe power delivery here is by those numbers we just discussed, the performance figures. Here, you can believe them only after you get behind the wheel and drive it on a road like this. Okay, so now let's you and I put aside power delivery and get to the far more important part of the equation here, and that is driving dynamics. First up, we have to understand what's underneath the vehicle, because it's far more important in a vehicle that is high. Up front, it's not exactly a strut and it's not exactly a double wishbone suspension. It's kind of a combination of both. There's a strut sort of thing up top, and then there is a two-part sort of wishbone at the bottom. And there it makes for unusually good control over the front of the vehicle. Like, you'd expect this thing getting out over its skis when you push it aggressively here, but I don't feel that sensation because the steering is so, I think controlled would be somewhat cliche to say here. Rather, you feel it's predictable. You feel there's a certain amount of confidence in the vehicle as you drive it, and that is a big function of the use of somewhat of a different architecture of suspension in the front. Now in the rear, that's kind of standard BMW. It's a multi-link unit. Good control over all planes of motion. Now granted, it's a big function of the dampers as well, and I think that's a big function of the combination of the choices of suspensions that are deployed here. Now it's not all puppy dogs and roses here. Remember back in the hangar, we discussed that this is the competition model, which changes a number of things, but it also changes the wheel sizes. Standard fitment is 20 inches, this is 21 inches, and you notice it in the ride quality. Now, I don't think folks are really considering ride quality when they think of a vehicle like this, but man, oh man, this thing is choppy to the point where you notice it, and it will absolutely tear your intestines out of the vehicle. And if that's what you like, then this is definitely the kind of vehicle one should consider. Then there's the steering itself. Good feedback. I'd say the weight is kind of middle of the road. I'd like to see a little bit more weight in the vehicle that's supposed to be the competition. Then we have to get to something that's really important, some of the changes in the bushings. That's specific to the X3M, so it's different than the standard X3s that roll off the factory line in South Carolina. And overall, you do notice this is a stiffer vehicle, and not just because of the adjustable dampers. Right now, you and I are in Sport Plus mode. There has been a couple of times where I feel I need to drive this thing in comfort mode, at least in the dampers, and that's something I normally don't do, but this, it's really stiff. Now, after some wheel time both on these types of roads as well as civilian surface streets of Los Angeles, my initial impression is it's not any one piece we just discussed. It's everything that works in conjunction with each other. And I'd say the topping, or like the cherry on top, would be the change in the specific bushings to make this thing a bit stiffer. Now that we understand that, there are two other items we need to focus on. First would be the brakes. For once in a blue moon, we're driving a BMW M car without carbon ceramic rotors. Up front, 395 millimeter rotors. In back, 370 millimeter rotors. And I've gone on record as saying BMW probably the best in the business when it comes to a more sporty application of steel rotors. I would argue this, it's not lacking for brake performance, especially considering this thing is almost 4,700 pounds. Pedal feel is good. I'd say this is kind of like a case study on how to do brakes without a $9,000 or $10,000 ad in a vehicle that's this type of an equation. Then speaking of this type of equation, there is one thing that is incredibly important for us to discuss, and that is the structure of the vehicle. It is far more important here than, say, an M3 all-wheel drive. Why is that? Because the vehicle is tall, the center of gravity is higher, the tendency for this thing to kind of fall in on itself as well as fall over to the side is much greater. So what do they do to change all of that? They do that a couple of different ways. Some of it has been pilfered from the X5M. Up front, there's a brace from strut tower to strut tower. Then there's a further two braces from the strut tower to the front of the vehicle. Then behind the firewall, there's an additional brace. Then underneath the rear of the vehicle, the subframe in the back, underneath the differential, there's a further A brace there, very similar, almost completely identical to what we saw on the X5M. Okay, so knowing that is all fine and good, but why is it important? Well, this has the wheelbase about the same size of a Nissan Rogue, so one wouldn't really think this is a large vehicle. So that's, what, 6 inches shorter than an X5. But it's still a pretty sizable vehicle, and yes, it's a tall vehicle. So strengthening the structure of the vehicle, working in conjunction with all the bits we talked about earlier of making the suspension, basically what's attached to this stiffer structure, making that stiffer makes this vehicle actually work. Like, I still, for the life of me, do not understand why people buy these things. If I want a performance car, I'm gonna buy a performance car. If I want a baby buggy, I'm gonna buy like a Tahoe or that new Toyota Sequoia. I gotta say, I like that thing a lot. But this, it's trying to do so many things, and you would think it wouldn't do it well. But this is where the parable is wrong. All of that stuff put together, it does it incredibly well. Yes, it is indeed that time again to play your favorite game, Mind the Options game, with today's contestant, something that could be considered a very tall M3. This is the 2022 BMW X3 M for a base price of $69,000. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, getting an M3 with all-wheel drive, that's considerably more expensive, $76,900. Now we press on to some details that have changed for 2022 in overall X3s. So they did kind of like a speed bump, if you will, a mid-cycle refresh. Changed some of the details in the back, like the taillights or the front, some of the details on the interior. It's not a huge change, but the thing we do need to focus on is the color here. And this, I have to say, is stunning. The frozen Marina Bay blue metallic. It really makes this thing pop. Like this, it doesn't really look that different from a regular X3, which there are a ton of them in Los Angeles. I gotta tell you, a ton of people like stop and point at this thing and say, wow, that's pretty cool. And it's something you put kids in. Anyway, that does come with a price, $4,500. Now, something I find fascinating and would be considered the flip side of paying a lot of extra money for paint would be the leather Merino Alcantara interior. That no extra charge. And I do like the two-tone, the black with the tan. Can we have more tan than black? Because it's kind of too much darkness in there. Then this one is the Competition. That does add the extra horsepower. It does make the seat belts have the M game colors on it, as well as some other bits, including 21-inch wheels, $4,000. Then the Executive Package, that's the heated steering wheel, the heated seats, both front and rear, the gesture control, and most importantly, the head-up display, $2,450. Then we move on to an incredibly important option, the M Drivers Package. This is paying an additional $2,500 to the company that built the car for a tune on the engine while it's still in the factory, and that tune changes the VMAX of the car. In this case, it brings it up to 177 miles an hour. I'd say money very well spent. Then the only other thing we add is the destination handling from the exotic port of call of Spartanburg, South Carolina. May I say, the Beacon, fantastic place to get onion rings. $995, which brings us to the total retail price of $87,345. Now, I would like to point out, the M3 all-wheel drive we had, what, about a month ago? That was $108,000. Being you and I have spent a lot of wheel time with BMWs as of late, I feel compelled to share some global notes on all BMWs, not just this one. First and foremost, the UX system. Yeah, I've talked about this, is probably one of the reference examples other car manufacturers should use, and that's after 20 years of being beaten up by folks like me saying they did a terrible job in 2002. Now it kind of works. But there's one detail that I've neglected to mention, and that is how the head-up display works in conjunction with the UX system. So things like switching between bands on the radio, radio stations, cruise control, navigation, all of that works with the head-up display, but it's not just a display. You can interact with it, so you don't have to take your eyes off the road and go here. What you can do is use the controls on the steering wheel. Then we need to press onto the seats, and here I've not been shy about my feelings of the handmade carbon fiber sport seats that have been in many of those M3 and M4s you and I have driven as of late. I love them. Most people I have tried them out hate them. I'd say a lot of people would like it better if there was at least an adjustable lumbar support, which exists in this version of the seat, which is not carbon fiber and not handmade, and as such, not as supportive. And I'd argue you kind of need them in a vehicle that's this much, there's no way to put it, it disturbs the occupants more than an M3 or M4 because you're simply sitting higher above the ground. Now, before you and I close out the notes section of this episode, I feel compelled to share a pet peeve with you. If one is considering writing a check for something, anything, that's about 100 grand, they need confidence in that decision. And that's usually in the details, not in the overall vehicle. You may remember the M4 convertible episode. I took issue with some of the build quality in that example, specifically the A-pillar, as well as some of the details around the vehicle. It just didn't inspire confidence in writing a check for $100,000. I'm a big believer that success leaves clues, and it's not the overall vehicle that I'm saying, oh my God, I gotta write a check for this. I wanna see the details of it. Like, for example, the Lexus LC500, that's about the same price as this, different equation. But the shocks that hold the hood up, they're more beautiful than the car itself. Get my drift? Okay, so let's go back to the nightmare scenario from the top of the episode. Do I see vehicles like this displacing the vehicles that you and I have elevated to a religious status in our lives, and in doing so, parted with many hard-earned dollars, pounds, and euros? Sort of. And here's the catch. In the BMW world, this is very good. It is way more magnificent than I thought it would be, but it's not fully to the magnificence of an M3 and M4 simply because of physics. It's here, an M3 and M4 are here. But that won't stop the likes of the copies of these putting a bullet in the head of the performance versions of the cars that we love. Like, for example, as much as I hate to say it, I don't see Cadillac doing V Blackwing sedans much longer. Same thing with the likes of Lexus. BMW It's their franchise. Their business was built on uber performance sedans, and they've got these M3s, and there's so many of us that are willing to pay money for it. I don't see it going away, but that means folks like us have to continue to buy cars, not baby buggies, even though this one is very good, which brings us to the wish list. And here, okay, it's a baby buggy, it's more practical, so let's embrace the practicality and add in more performance while we're doing so. 48-volt mild hybrid system, like we have in the M440i, let's do it here, but not with the accessory drive, more like the Mercedes, and let's add some like plug-in hybrid range to it. I'm not thinking 30 miles, I'm thinking like 50 to 80 miles. Yeah, it would be expensive, but this thing is already 90 grand, and that would be a game changer because it's a different vehicle that could take advantage of all the EV tax schemes around the world, but still maintain the performance while doing so. And this is the point of the episode where I turn this around to you guys to opine in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, instead of me hounding you to subscribe, notify, like, and share these episodes, I'm going to share a little bit behind the scenes here. In the B-roll of this episode, you saw this vehicle not by itself, you saw it with a lovely classic red Jaguar. Now you would think that Kumo and I placed it next to the blue car because there was a nice contrast and it looked beautiful, but in reality, we were just too lazy to move the Jag out of the hangar. But it looked great, didn't it? Till I see you in the next episode, bis später.